Hey guys, and welcome back to another week. It's hard to believe for me, I'm sure for you as well, that we've made it to the final stage of child development in our study this semester of growth through from birth through adolescence. So this week we're looking at physical development in adolescence. So biological changes, body changes, a little bit about the brain, and of course we'll focus more on that next week when we cognitive. So I would encourage you this week really to take a look at your grades and make sure that you know what your grade is, recognize if there's anything missing that you might need to resubmit. If you received partial credit on something, you're able to make changes and adjust and then resubmit for additional credit, so you can still do that through the same point in the semester that extra credit is due. The extra credit assignment will be posted, so you can choose whether you feel like that's something you need to do or not, and then submit that within the next week or two. And then just in general, if you have any questions. So I would encourage you to really take a look at that this week, as we've got only a couple weeks left. And if there's anything that you're going to want to submit or change, you need to do that sooner rather than later. If we get to the very last week of class, you will not be able to submit things that are missing. Or realize at that point that your grade is, a small percentage away from bumping up or something like that. You need to really take a look at that sooner. So I would encourage you to do that this week and make sure that you are well aware and confident in what your grade looks like and how we're going to proceed through the end of the semester. So we will do a middle childhood review this week in our Canvas module, and then look at adolescence. And so again, adolescence, physical development is going to include puberty, obviously. Physical growth and changes of the body itself, some brain growth, and then sleep, diet, and exercise are a pretty big deal for adolescents. And then there are some also disorders and syndromes that can demonstrate or present themselves in adolescence that we'll look at as well this week. There is some overlap between the disorders that we're going to talk about this week and emotional development, but it'll make sense, I think, as we look at it this week. Why we're kind of looking at them here and how they're impacted by physical development. So middle childhood review, just as a reminder, biosocial, cognitive, and psychosocial development. This is a bulleted list here of some of the things we talked about that are important. And then there's a few slides that goes over them more in depth. So I would encourage you to take a look at these and refresh yourself on them. These are good to print to have for notes if you want notes on the middle childhood section of the textbook and the chapters. These 3 slides will kind of group everything together and help you to remember it and have it in one place where it might be helpful for the final exam. It does help to kind of reflect also on middle childhood as we move into adolescence, because a lot of what has happened or not happened in middle childhood is going to directly impact adolescent development and how things look in this stage. So concrete operational thought started to develop in middle childhood review. That's going to be very important to the development of further thought and thought processes in adolescence, and so on and so forth. So you'll see those comparisons, and you have the review in your PowerPoint, and you can go back to the chapters as well. But this should be helpful in understanding what we're going to start talking about this week. So we've gone through 5 stages of development so far. Well, we're on the 5th now. This is the 5th. And so remember the ages that were associated with each of the stages that we went through. Prenatal development happens before birth, obviously, and then infant and toddler is infant and toddler comes after prenatal birth, and then early childhood is 2 to 6 years, middle childhood is 6 to 10/11, and then adolescence begins around 11 years old through 18 when you become an adult. So we are moving into the teenage years this week. 11 to 18 years old is adolescence. And so obviously the pretty big thing that happens developmentally, biologically or physically, is puberty. And so puberty is technically and medically speaking, if you want to know the actual medical term for it is, we all know what it is, right? We've all been through puberty, we know what it is. But medically speaking, it's the time between the first onrush of hormones and full adult physical development. So puberty, for example, in our minds, sometimes we when a female gets her period, we say, oh, she started puberty. Or, when a male starts developing more muscles or more hair in different places on the body, we say, oh, you started puberty. But in reality, puberty actually stretches for several years throughout adolescence, um, because adult physical development, complete physical development, doesn't actually happen until late teens, maybe even early 20s. So puberty can last 3 to 5 years, and that's really only the physical development that happens or takes place or is completed in those 3 to 5 years. In order to reach psychosocial maturity, we really see, like I said before, many more years for that to happen, and that usually is not until earlier, even mid-20s, sometimes for males. Puberty usually starts between 8 and 14 years old. Again, it lasts 3 to 5 years, so approximately 4, and it's triggered by hormones. So once your body starts producing those hormones, then puberty begins. And so, what are the hormones? An organic chemical substance that's produced by a body tissue and conveyed via the bloodstream to affect some body function. So we have chemicals or hormones in our bodies that regulate hunger, sleep, mood, stress, sexual desire, immunity, reproduction, every function, right? Breathing. I mean, just about everything you do is regulated by a hormone. And so in the case of puberty, there's specific hormones which are responsible for the onset of puberty and released by the body at some point during the stage. Namely, and most frequently known and recognized by us, are estrogen and testosterone. And so those hormones are going to be produced by the body, and that's going to trigger puberty to start, and those puberty-like symptoms to happen. So there is quite a bit of recent research in the last several years, maybe decade now, um, for puberty, the early onset of puberty happening. So the age that puberty starts has decreased, meaning girls are getting their period at a younger age, for example. And specifically in the United States, we're seeing quite a lot of early onset puberty, which is not necessarily a good thing. There's kind of some big concerns with that happening that we don't necessarily want to see. So there's an article that you'll have this week, and you can take some time to look at this and reflect on why you think um, there's an early onset, or some of the things we can do to help support our children in hopefully preventing the early onset of puberty. And so there's a variety of factors. Okay, it's not any one factor. There is a variety of factors. This is not a comprehensive list of all of the things contributing to early onset of puberty, but these are some of the ones that we've had research on in the last several decades and have been shown to be contributors to early onset of puberty. So our environment is one, namely what we eat. If you guys remember in recent years, depending on how old you are, there's a huge push for labeling on food products, milk specifically, to identify if there's something called a growth hormone in that food, because we need to identify that and be familiar with that as a society. So you should now see labels on milk that say not treated with growth hormones, and that's very important. Look for that label and seek it out if you can, because those growth hormones is giving our body a false surge of hormones too early, especially depending on how much milk we drink, for example. And that can cause early onset of puberty, which again is not a good thing. We want puberty to happen organically in the body. We want it to happen when it's supposed to happen. We want it to happen based on our body's own production of hormones, and not something environmental that sort of falsely jumpstarts puberty. So that's one big one. And milk is not the only food, by the way. There's many other foods that can be and are treated with hormones. So that's really something to look for. Organic foods, of course, have different regulations. And so if this is something that you're concerned about, it's definitely something to watch for in what you're eating and drinking. There is some genetic variation between families and ethnic groups. So African Americans have been found to reach puberty um, on average 7 months earlier than European or Hispanic Americans. And Chinese Americans on average are reaching it several months later. So again, it could be genetic, and there's only so much control we have over that, right? I mean, there's nothing you can do about your genes like we've talked about before, but we do know from the study of epigenetics, which we also talked about early on in this semester, that some of those things can be changed or modified, or those gene markers can be turned on and off by things we do or don't do. So again, thinking back to environment, um, if you know that you're already genetically predisposed to early onset of puberty, there might be some other things you want to do to try to take precautions against that. Girls do start puberty typically 2 years ahead of boys. That's just partly because of natural biological development. Girls, just in general, develop earlier than boys do. Um, Body fat is another one. The heavier you are, the sooner you experience puberty. And this is a pretty big deal, right? We talked about this a lot in middle childhood, and how important it is to really have a healthy diet and a balance of that diet. And so we know, of course, that obesity is linked to so many other things, but early onset of puberty is one of them. And again, it's pretty concerning, right? This is a problem. The reason for this is because the hormones are actually stored in body fat. So estrogen, for example, in females is stored in body fat, and so you have to be over 100, around 100, 115 pounds in order to actually start your period, because you won't be producing or storing enough estrogen until you've reached that weight. So if girls have reached that weight at a very young age, um, they have an overage of estrogen that's stored, and that can cause them to start their periods earlier. Environmental toxins, including the use of pesticides, has been shown to decrease the age for onset of puberty. Stress. So again, these are things to watch for, be mindful of. We do want to avoid early onset of puberty if possible, and take any precautions we can, hopefully, to avoid that. Um, so we want to also consider the circadian rhythm. So there's an article in your module this week that you can read, and you'll have a little bit of time to think about this and discuss it further. But circadian rhythm basically is our body's natural rhythm of sleep and wake cycle, right? You've probably heard of this. So your body naturally gets tired, starts producing melatonin late in the evening when it's dark. You get tired. And then in the morning when the sun comes up, you naturally wake up, right? And you rouse and kind of get going for the day. And so for teens, because of everything that's happening in their body, their circadian rhythm actually gets shifted a few hours off. In other words, they're not tired until maybe 11, midnight, 1 a.m., and they're not getting up until later in the morning. But as we know, for school and functioning in society and other things, they have to be up earlier, right, and be out the door. So this circadian rhythm can really get thrown off. And a lack of sleep or sleep disturbances can lead to a plethora of other problems, including some of the mental health disorders that we'll talk about later. So it truly is important to try to address this with teens if possible and get them enough sleep. If it means you have to force them to go to bed a little bit earlier, and get away from the screen. Blue light can affect circadian rhythm, so being on your cell phone right before you go to bed, watching TV, etc. Some of those precautions can really be helpful to help teens function at their best, and hopefully avoid some of the mental health issues that can and probably are likely to come if they don't have enough sleep. So it is a natural response in the brain. Phase delay is what happens during puberty. That's the name for it. That's the way the body reacts to light and dark, and it just slows some or changes a little bit. And you'll see more about this in the article. And so some of the problems it causes, as I just mentioned, are sleep deprivation, wide awake and hungry at weird times, half asleep with no appetite all morning. So there are ways to fix this. It's going to take some scheduling with the teen, and some compromises on both sides, right? On both behalf of both parent and child, in order to make sure that they're able to get enough sleep, which is really, really important. Again, this is not a comprehensive list, so these are just a few of the things that can happen if you're sleep deprived. And as an adult or college student, some of these probably look familiar, right? If you have sleep deprivation or an irregular sleep schedule, it actually can cause nightmares and insomnia. So you literally do get overtired, just like a toddler does, right? And then have a more difficult time falling asleep or staying asleep because you're so tired. And so in order to avoid that, it's important to get enough sleep and get it at the right times. Mood disorders can be caused by sleep deprivation, and there's a list there of just a few. We'll look at some more this week. Falling asleep while driving, which is very dangerous when teens are young and learning to drive, and they're so at risk anyways for those issues, as well as learning problems in school, focusing, etc. So shifting gears a little bit here, what do we see as far as physical bodies? In adolescence, we do go through another growth spurt, and this is partly going to be generated and coincide with puberty, but not fully. So there's a change in weight. Adolescents usually have huge appetites. They start to eat a lot more and gain weight. girls are going to actually gain fat at 2 times the percentage or 2 times the rate that boys gain muscle. So just naturally, as far as natural development goes, boys are developing muscle in adolescence and puberty, and girls are developing fat. And again, these are normal body processes, normal and healthy. We want to see them happen. So when we have girls in puberty get very concerned, or in adolescence get very concerned with their weights and try to start managing their weight, yes, to some degree that's healthy, right? We want to be eating healthy, eating the right amounts, but we certainly don't want to try to be losing weight if we're already at a healthy weight. And so eating disorders can be problematic because it can actually affect the body's, again, the natural developmental process of the body that's necessary and helpful for shifting and transitioning to adulthood. Height will shift, but until it does, they're probably going to be pudgy and a little bit clumsy. At some point, they'll grow. Again, that's different, just depending on every child. Some grow earlier and then don't grow again into adulthood, and then others have a late growth spurt and are a little bit shorter and then grow all at once later in puberty. So it just depends on the child, but they at some point will have a growth spurt and gain quite a bit of height during adolescence. Muscles increase in power. So strength increases. Boys double in strength during puberty. Your ability to run longer, for example, or do more cardio is going to increase because your lung capacity is going to get greater and stronger. So it is a good and an okay time to, start doing some weightlifting or start doing some exercise or something like that. That is healthy for the body, of course, in moderation. So a good coach or athletic trainer will know and be familiar with the child's growth spurt and what's going on and kind of monitor that in order to make sure that the amount of weight that's being lifted and the strength training, et cetera, is appropriate depending on that child's specific growth. Organ growth happens as well. So, all of our body parts and organs are kind of getting to be where they're going to be as an adult. So the lungs triple in weight, heart doubles in size. Because of that, obviously, our endurance improves. Our tonsils and our adenoids decrease in size, which means we're less prone to get sick, colds, asthma, etc. You really shouldn't be sick very often in adolescence if you're a generally healthy sort of individual. And as I mentioned a second ago, weightlifting and athletic training should be tailored to an adolescent size the previous year. So I may be a certain weight right now, but that doesn't necessarily mean that my bones are strong enough to support the weight that I can physically lift. You might want to decrease because the muscles and organs are immature and they develop later than the body and the muscles themselves. So our muscles may be ready, but our organs may not be, etc. So it's just something to think about. So psychological disorders, finishing up here. There's a lot of psychological disorders that can present themselves in adolescence. And there's a lot of different reasons for these and for this, depending on which one you're looking at. And you'll get a chance to look at one or two of these this week. I would encourage you to choose one to focus on that you're not familiar with or that seems new to you, and to spend some time learning about that because they'll be helpful in the next couple chapters, especially in 2 chapters when we talk about emotional development in adolescence. So genetically, some of these are just prone to onset in adolescence. Schizophrenia, for example, that it's natural for schizophrenia symptoms and behaviors to develop in adolescence or in their early 20s. It doesn't mean that you caught schizophrenia suddenly. It's just you were genetically predisposed to it, and that's just the time when it presents itself, and that's normal. Some of these, like dissociative and somatization, factitious, some of these disorders are because of the way of thinking in adolescence. And so there's a certain thought process that happens in adolescence because of underdeveloped emotions or emotional health. And so that can contribute to some of these. Some of them, like anxiety or mood or personality or depression, perhaps can be caused by stress or bullying. And this is where that middle childhood study comes into play here. A lot of the things we talked about there can carry over here into adolescence. And so if they're not dealt with or addressed, or they've been problematic and continue to be, because of all the shifts and all the hormones and all the changes in adolescence, those things can become really problematic and can lead to some development of additional disorders or psychological issues such as those that we see on this list. Any and all of the above of those ones that we just looked at on the last slide will have an impact on learning. And this is the cycle of the impact on learning. Depression specifically, this is the depressive cycle. So it can start anywhere on the cycle, as you can see here, it's a continuous cycle, right? So one thing leads to another, etc., and then you just sort of get in this cycle that you have to break in order to get out of. It could start with your education being interrupted because of the thought, I'm no good at anything, which then leads to negative emotions. Because your education's interrupted or you're not doing well, that then leads to negative behaviors, such as being gloomy or withdrawal. And then you get negative responses from others, such as being avoided by them, right? And then it's going to be interrupted again. And so the cycle just is continuous and can impact learning. And because of an adolescent's development, how they think, the way that they think, and the way that they kind of process the world, this can be a very dangerous cycle that we really need to get them out of. So identifying any one part and starting there as a treatment, or as a way to sort of identify the problem and deal with it can be helpful, because otherwise this cycle will just continue. And again, that can be very problematic for an adolescent's development and their functioning and their further growth. So we'll finish this week with a chapter review. As always, I hope this was helpful and you guys learned something, and I will see you next week for adolescent cognitive development.